Good evening, everybody. Galen Clavio here. Welcome back to the SCRA Show, episode 6, as we get set to talk sport, social media, politics, conspiracy theories, love it or list it. All kinds of different things possibly here on this show tonight. You never know what we're going to quite talk about, but we're looking forward to it as always, and we'd like to thank you folks for tuning in once again, as we've got our regular panelists, what's become our regular panel, and I'm happy that you folks are our regular panel because it's a fun group to hang out with. Back here on a Tuesday night, Lauren Reichard-Smith joining us. Lauren, how you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you? And I just want to say I do not support the HGTV chat. I'm sorry. I don't condone it. It's not acceptable.
I think that's a mistake on your part. I think you're missing. I was trying to describe this to Lauren last night via text. And I'm curious about how Brian looks at this. Like I think I started watching HGTV back in the day because the shows were kind of novel. Like the idea of people going around and watching, watching people shop for houses and renovate their homes and things like that. Like it was interesting. Now I'd mostly just watch it because I find most of the people in the episodes so annoying. And it's not just the guests, it's also the hosts. Like almost in every case, the hosts are just as annoying in their own special way that it's almost just like great, negative people watching, I guess would be the way I would put it. And then so I think if you can embrace that, which I'm sure you do that with sports in some degree, Lauren, then I think you would actually enjoy the HGTV experience a lot more.
I do, but there's only so many hours in the day, only so many days in the week, and what I choose to fill up my time with is not HGTV. I just find it fascinating that it's me, the female, that's very no HGTV, and the two guys on this panel are all like, yay, flip-flops, and love it and list it, and leave it and go somewhere else, or whatever these shows are.
Not a show. Flip or flop. Come on, get the shows right. But no, Dr. Brian Moritz joining me as well on the show. Brian, obviously, what is your perspective on the whole HGTV phenomenon? How do you use it in your daily life?
I'm so ashamed of you both right now.
I mean, how do I use it? I mean, how don't I use it? What was really funny was my wife and I were just house hunting. We were house hunters, as you will. And when we go to a house, and what's very funny is you watch these shows, and they're like pegged as reality TV, but they're the most unreal depictions of how you look at real estate and what you look for, and it's like these wonderful cliches of looking for granite countertops. Check. Okay, whatever. Space to entertain is always a great one. It's like the drinking game whenever looking. Well, we need good space to entertain. And it's just
I like the whole timber loft thing. That's become relatively new.
Oh, that is new. Yes. It's just wonderful. I mean, it's great background noise. My wife loves it because it's great. Kind of like you get to see how people decorate their houses and design it. It's kind of like like low-level sanctified voyeurism, and it's kind of fun. So
isn't that what Pinterest is for?
Pinterest is boring, though. Like Pinterest, I mean, seriously. Like people talk about Pinterest on Facebook. I don't want that. At least not the people that talk about Pinterest tend to not be people that I would personally want to have regular conversations with. And so, and I know that's painting with a broad general brush there, but it is interesting, Brian, because and I promise, Lauren, this is the last thing I'll say on anything HGTV related, at least for the next minute or two. But I actually have friends of mine, one of whom I've known since first grade, was actually on House Hunters when they were shopping for a vacation home, and I haven't actually talked to him or his wife about the experience yet, but it is definitely an interesting sort of thing.
I know a guy, like friend of friend who was on House Hunters, regular House Hunters, and it's just so funny to read about how staged that show is, and once you kind of know, like basically the way I understand it is like they've already like bought the house, and they're just looking at two other completely random ones that they're not even considering, and right. you can absolutely tell, like most episodes, like this is the random one with no furniture and a leaking roof that they came in to look at, and like their stuff's already in the other one, so it's
right. It's amazing.
A conspiracy theory is what it is. It's an HGTV conspiracy theory.
I do. I will say I have been thinking about ways we could merge sports and HGTV programming. Like, like do a love it or list it, but with a stadium. So, like for instance, like when the I'm trying to who's the team that's recently like threatened to go to a new stadium, but instead of actually getting a new stadium, you bring that.
Oh, this is perfect Buffalo Bills programming,
Yes.
right?
Yes. So instead of just getting land for a new stadium to replace Rich Stadium, they bring in the woman and they have her renovate Rich Stadium on the inside, and they have the creepy dude like showing them plots of land in and around the city. It would be perfect.
This is spectacular, and we're on. I smell ICS panel right here. I don't know why.
ICS. I smell Emmy, man. Emmy is what I smell at this stage. All right, come on. So. We'll think of other tie-ins, and folks, if you have any ideas, how can we combine HGTV programming with sports so that Lauren can participate in this conversation with a clear conscience? Just let us know.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that.
We're always looking out for you, Lauren. Don't worry.
I
Anyway,
appreciate that. Thanks.
we had some things we did want to talk about that were sports related. I promise. And the reason I've got, if you notice, everything's foggy around me. That's actually on purpose. I'm trying to. The lighting is imperfect because most of my good lights burned out, so I'm trying to make it look more intimate when in fact it just looks crappy in here. So, just bear with me on that, folks.
We'll call you Barbara Walters for the night. It's your Barbara Walters focus.
I can deal with that, absolutely. I'll start off by asking you what kind of tree you think you would be. No, let's talk a little bit about. Lauren mentioned the conspiracy theory thing. We had some doozies pop up here over the last couple of days on the college and professional levels, and it got me thinking about the way that audiences tend to digest these things. And so I'm going to give you a couple of them to start with. We had an article in the New York Post. It is a reputable journalistic outlet, at least in some circles. It's got a publisher, and a lot of money is spent advertising in it. So you've got that going for it. But they ran an article. Was it today, Brian?
It was Sunday.
It was Sunday about Spygate and how of course, if you don't remember, Spygate was that whole thing with the Patriots where they got caught videotaping other teams, and they had to forfeit a draft pick, and Bill Belichick got fined like $250,000, and nothing else was ever really done about it, even though, according to this New York Post article, there have been additional problems with spying by the Patriots on other teams, and nothing else has been done about them. And even Bill Simmons, who's a diehard Patriots fan, talked about how he didn't trust Goodell's judgment on it now in light of what happened with the Ray Rice situation. So you had that. Then we had this story floating around on the internet from a website. What was the name of the website, Lauren?
It was on secexposed.wordpress.com. So maybe not as reputable as the Post, but there you have it.
It's always a good sign if you've got a source that is something.wordpress.com.
They haven't even spent the $18 to register their own domain name. So
right.
They're committed.
But this whole
tagline. Can I say their tagline because it's beautiful? We seek to expose the truth behind the SEC college athletics supremacy illusion and NCAA corruption in college athletics. So there you have it.
It's a catchy tagline. You got to give them that. I mean, really, that's some high quality writing there. But no, the story in question, and I would suggest you seek it out and read it, just because it's a trip. But it basically argues that ESPN, in cahoots with the SEC, or really more at the behest of the SEC, like they're doing the SEC's bidding, is purposely trying to ruin Jameis Winston's life and career because he's a threat to the supremacy of the SEC, and that ESPN has basically manufactured all of these stories surrounding Jameis Winston, that all of the charges against him, well, they claim there aren't any charges to begin with, but if there were charges, that they would be trumped-up charges, and it goes on for quite a while, basically detailing how the SEC is this omnipotent and evil being, and they move ESPN around like a pawn on a chessboard. And Lauren, let me start with you on this. You were taken aback, I think maybe would be the proper term, when you read this at first. It's it's definitely the funny thing about these sorts of things is, to me, there is a certain whiff of conspiracy theory in a lot of what gets talked about with sports today, and a lot of that I think comes back to the fact that you have venues like this blog and other places like it on the internet, like message boards, that allow people to develop these sort of pet theories and gain almost immediate acceptance from everybody that surrounds them because it fits within the hegemony of what they already want to believe.
Yes. And if you follow me on Twitter, I did tweet out a link to the story, so if you would like to read it, I suggest you do. It's a fascinating read. I don't know if I was taken aback so much as amused, because of all, I mean, the post-conspiracy story was, interesting, and I remember Spygate, but this story was just so over the top. And when I emailed the two of you, I think my favorite part of the story was when they named Jameis Winston's alleged rape as him just being sexually promiscuous. But you're right. I mean, this does give a voice to fans, and I kind of hate myself for tweeting out this link because it's going to give clickbait to this person who spent probably a lot of time writing this montage.
I hope they spent a lot of time on it, because if that just came out like that, then there's some problems there. Brian, Brian, what was your perspective on that, on the post story? This whole concept of we've got a sports fan base, not just here in the U.S. I mean, we see this in England, I know, especially having followed Premier League soccer quite a bit. I don't know if it exists in Canada, but maybe the conspiracy theories in Canada all surround HGTV shows. It's quite possible, but it seems like we've got this very conspiratorially minded group of people out there, and whether that's something relatively mild, like, oh, the officials are conspiring against our team, or whether it's something really big, like the NFL is trying to cover up, continued spying by New England Patriots, it is an interesting psychological phenomenon that we seem to see over and over again now.
Yeah, it is. And what kind of struck me on the Spygate story was this notion of, this was reported in the story, and apparently there's a book about the untold story of Spygate or something like that.
That was a shock to me too, yeah.
Right. But the story, it goes that the Patriots were using like this separate radio frequency to talk to Tom Brady after the radios get shut off 15 seconds, so they were basically telling him what play to run as the play clock was running down. And that's where, to use your phrase from email today, that kind of went into tinfoil hat mode and level of conspiracy. And look, nobody wants to see the Patriots humiliated and embarrassed more than me, but it does kind of strike me as this, there's always been, and this is kind of, I think, amplified by social media and by blogs, but this, the refs are out to screw, the refs are favoriting them, and they're screwing us over. If I had I don't follow Bill's Twitter on Sunday specifically for this reason. And they lost to the Patriots this past week, and the Bills fandom was all in arms that the refs had, it was the refs' fault. They had screwed the Bills over, and because maybe it feels, I don't know, maybe it feels better to admit that than to think, well, maybe Tom Brady's just really good and they're better than our team, and that can be it can be hard to, I don't know if that's a unique part of fandom or just kind of something that has come out a little more, but it seems that it's hard. And rather than just admit my team got beat, the other team's probably better, it's easy to kind of latch onto this, no, we got screwed, we got hosed, and then online it kind of feeds into itself and kind of becomes this never-ending cycle of kind of this fire that always has the supply of oxygen to burn.
Yeah, and Ann Peguero, who's watching, actually just put something in the Q&A that said, no, all the conspiracy theories are about hockey up here. There's a conspiracy to keep the Leafs mediocre at best. To which I would probably reply to that, and I'm sure you know this, and the Leafs don't need any help. That's right. That's right. They do a hell of a job of keeping themselves pretty mediocre. But it is funny to me because, I mean, I've been around online culture for a long time. I mean, long before I entered academia, long before, frankly, even I entered the profession. I was on the message boards. I was very much at the forefront of watching some of these rumors take place. And it's interesting because traditionally or historically, when they happened online, they pretty much just stayed there. But Lauren, I feel like we see more and more now. Enough people say something is happening or imply that something is happening, and the mainstream media almost feels compelled to at least give some degree of attention to it. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen more often than we would have expected, and it's mostly because you get a critical mass of people all talk something online, and a lot of media people who cover sports seem to think, oh, well, all these people are talking about it, therefore we need to talk about it.
Well, absolutely, and if you want to start driving this conversation in the direction of theory, I think this is where we can start talking about the flip-flop in agenda setting. Who's setting the agenda anymore? You're smiling. Did you like that segue?
Can we call it the flip or flop in agenda setting?
Oh my God. No, I'm going to leave. I'm going to get up and walk off this show right now. I don't even know how to recover from that.
Sorry about that.
But no, you're right. You do have a critical mass of people talking about something, whether it's something small like, oh my gosh, the refs blew the call at the game. I mean, I don't know how many people watched the Auburn football game this weekend, but there were some, and I'll own my fandom, there were some questionable calls. Would it have made a difference in the game? I don't know. But, the same thing happened over in the Alabama game. I saw, there's questionable calls going on there. Enough people start talking about it, gathers steam. Well, does the media, if they're picking up on it, then is it the media telling us what to think, or is it us telling the media what they should be telling us what should be thinking? So, I think there's a question on what really is agenda setting anymore.
I mean, I think there's the audience. The audience has always been a news value. I mean, in looking at media sociology and looking at news construction, that's always been an idea and an important part of it. It's kind of like you write what the audience wants to know, or news, what you should be talking about, stuff like that. Two things I find interesting with this are, one, the emergence of the dead spins and the big leads now as not I don't know if they fit in the mainstream. That's a weird definition for them, but as important national players. Somebody writes about this on SEC Exposure, WordPress.com. We find it, we don't find it, whatever. That gets picked up by Deadspin and linked to. Now all of a sudden, that's one of the 5 major sites, and now this kind of enters the conversation and kind of gets blessed by Deadspin in a way by covering it. And also, one of the things that it's happening is with online news and digital news and the growth of and the maturing of metrics. Metrics are becoming an important news value for journalists and for their website. It's becoming much more important. Like, hey, people are really talking about this story, or people are really buzzing about this story. Let's get something up here. Let's get a post to drive engagement, drive traffic, drive conversation on our site. That's a real news value. And I think that these are the types of stories, especially sports-wise, that really drive traffic. I mean, if you're a Florida State reporter, there's going to be a temptation to put this blog on your site, and what do you guys think of this?
Well, and particularly if the outcome of this next couple of weeks ends up with Jameis Winston somehow no longer enrolled at Florida State, which is something that I forget who it was. Was it ESPN that ran that article that said his best legal recourse might be to drop out of school?
It was SI. It was McCann, the SI's legal writer who wrote that. So
can we add them to the SEC-sponsored conspiracy against Florida State?
I don't know. I'll send a link into that blog and tell them that Sports Illustrated and ESPN need you to hate Jameis Winston to add to his story.
I mean, it is obviously with most conspiracy theories, they're the ultimate inconvenience sampling, because they tend to very selectively bring in the facts and metered opinions, and then from that point forward, they're pretty easily impeachable if you know your stuff. And most of the time with the internet, they really hinge upon people not knowing their stuff. And a topic that we talked about earlier on a couple weeks ago was the Jerry Sandusky situation with Penn State, and the sheer number of people who are not only convinced that Paterno got railroaded, but that there was an active conspiracy theory on the part of the media you know, and it was wide-ranging. I mean, it went from everywhere from the Penn State student newspaper all the way up to ESPN and Sports Illustrated to somehow manufacture this story. But the payoff on that has always seemed a little bit questionable to me. And I guess, you know, at the end of the day, it does, I will say this, it does make you wonder how the average consumer is supposed to view things. Because you do have, you know, I mean, obviously, I think the idea that ESPN is somehow doing the SEC's bidding by trying to run Jameis Winston out of college football, that's a bit loony. But I don't think it's completely loony, even though I don't buy necessarily the whole thing on its face, that the NFL tried to hide large elements of the Spygate story because this was a marquee franchise and they felt like they took enough steps at the beginning that they could, you know, staunch the bleeding. Just as, you know, it's hard to look at what happened with the Manti Te'o situation and not feel like there was at the very least some light collusion by some of these media members who happen to really want to put forward the idea of this idyllic Notre Dame athlete in the press as somebody who might be, you know, an award recipient. Now, the issue I have here, and Brian, let me go to you on this first, is when you see situations that are merely incompetence or, you know, just not doing your job particularly well from a media perspective, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should automatically leap to the idea that there's some kind of grand conspiracy going on behind the scenes. Right. But for the average person who doesn't understand how media operate, you know, they're going to think that because it seems to be that way and because there's people pushing that agenda all over the place, it seems like, on the internet.
Right, and it can be seductive to believe. It can be easy to believe that, you know, the media, you know, and this can stretch into politics, this can stretch into sports, you know, that the media is out to screw with you, out to screw up your point of view or to screw your team. And again, if things don't go as you think they should, it can be very, again, seductive, easy to think, well, somebody's responsible for this.
Well, and I think that, and just to jump in, and Lauren, you know, I think we'll keep it with Brian for a second here, but I want to get Lauren's take on this as well. The media are not helping themselves with the business partnerships that they are signing with this, and I mean, as much tinfoil hattery as we saw in that Florida State case, it is hard to ignore the fact that the SEC network does have, you know, a direct business relationship with ESPN, much like the Big Ten network has a direct business relationship with Fox. And, you know, after a while, you know, it does, you know, even with what we've seen with the Ray Rice situation, it's hard to necessarily believe that those business relationships aren't coming to the forefront in terms of the editorial coverage that's being provided to some of these sports. And Brian, I don't know what the answer is as far as how the media solve that. I don't know where they are, you know, how do they effectively demonstrate, yes, we've drawn this line and it never gets crossed, when it seems obvious that it does get crossed on a regular basis.
No, it does get crossed, I think you're right. And you know, every conspiracy theory, even the looniest ones, have the smallest grain of truth or the smallest basis in somewhat truth. And it is hard for media because you can't prove a negative. You can't say, no, we weren't influenced on it. Well, how do you prove that you weren't influenced on it? You can't prove a negative. So as long as those relationships are there, it is, you know, a lot of, you know, it comes down to perception. And if you want to believe, again, that your favorite player, favorite team is getting hosed or your arch rival is cheating and the media is covering it up, well, you can probably look to whatever, you know, the corporate partnerships, and you can look to any mistakes, or not even mistakes, but just like, okay, the NFL covered it and the story's done, you know, punished them, story's done. Well, why didn't you keep digging? Story was done, they punished them. Well, why didn't you keep digging? And then it just kind of cycles, and then it just kind of spirals and spirals, and then the media is kind of in a no-win situation in that point because they can't prove why they didn't do something. Or like you said with Manti Te'o, if it was just a mistake, you know, bad judgment, bad, you know, they didn't do a good job, they let this slip through. Now all of a sudden, all your work looks sloppy and suspect, and not nefariously, just, you know, once you make a mistake, you can't close that lid again.
Lauren?
I'll speak to the Manti Te'o idea, because I'm wondering, when you brought that up, how much of it looks like conspiracy theory is really just people trying to save face. Because with the Manti Te'o incident, when that all went on, as the story unfolded, and it was, oh, this is so terrible, and look at Manti Te'o, he's so brave. In hindsight, 2020, we all look back and think, did nobody think to check this out? And did nobody think to verify any of this? And so did maybe somebody verify it and realize, oh my gosh, we verified this and it looks horrible, and now we look horrible, so let's just keep the story going. And I think we kind of saw that when it happened with Josh Shaw a few weeks ago at USC. Mm-hmm. That broke a lot quicker. But again, that was incompetence of people not doing their job. If it hadn't been outed as quickly, how long would they have kept going to try and save face? I'm curious in that balance of.
I think that's a great point, and I think a lot of the conceptualizations of conspiracy theory from fans when it deals with media comes from this. I'm going to say it. There's almost a compromised relationship that a lot of reporters have with the sports that they cover, because that's how they gain access. I mean, you have to have a friendly relationship with the coach. You have to have a friendly relationship with the athletic director or the general manager. And as we've seen in the NFL situation with guys like Schefter and guys like Chris Mortensen, the day-to-day currency of being an NFL reporter, or if you're a beat writer for Syracuse or for Indiana, the day-to-day currency of doing that job is getting those tidbits that other people aren't getting the one-on-one interviews. The problem is, if you're doing that, then your eyes are not going to be open to the other things that are going on that are potentially newsworthy and potentially negative for the organization in question. And so when those things aren't covered, then it looks simply like, oh, there's a cover-up going on here. And and Brian, that feeds on itself, because if we've learned one thing about the internet over the last 15 years, it's that it's got a really long memory.
It really does. I did want to speak to Manti Te'o because I did my advisor and I did a study on the news repair of Manti Te'o, basically how reporters talked about their job after it came out. And Pete Thamel has said that he reached out to Stanford, got conflicting reports, couldn't track down the fake girlfriend, was on a ridiculously tight deadline for a magazine reporter. And that's not an excuse, but he basically reported it Sunday and had to have it done by Monday. Again, no excuse, but explaining that kind of gap in it. What I found so fascinating about the Te'o story, looking back on it, was when the Deadspin story broke on that, the Deadspin story didn't come right out and say that Te'o was faking it, but I think it was like the quote was like 80% sure he's in on it. And that was the implication of the first story, that this was a big hoax perpetrated by Te'o, that like, I'm doing this story. And how quickly, once the catfishing angle came out, whether true, whether it was a fall guy, it was pretty convenient that the fall guy, that the story broke like it did. But once it went to catfishing, I feel like, in looking back on it, a lot of the criticism of the sports journalists fell away, because it's one thing if Te'o's lying and you can expose him, but if Te'o's being faked out and catfished by someone, that is a little more complicated. Because the question I always came back to on that was, you're writing the Manti Te'o story and you decide, okay, I'm going to track down his girlfriend, and you start going down the path, and all of a sudden there's nothing. You don't find him.
Yeah.
What do you do in that moment? Like, it's an honest question I have for reporters. What do you do in that moment? Most of them I've talked to said they write around it.
Yeah, but I guess hold on, one thing, Lauren, and I'll get back to you. But there's one thing about that I've always struggled with, is that you're right. A lot of the criticism of Te'o fell away immediately when the catfishing angle came out, but most of the criticism that fell away immediately was the criticism that was coming from media members who frankly had a vested interest in desperately wanting there to be a plausible explanation for Te'o having invented this story. And so, and that's, again, I guess that if you're looking at it from a conspiratorial perspective, if I'm the average consumer and I don't have a vested interest in Manti Te'o being somehow wronged, not wrong, but wronged in this situation, then I'm going to look at the catfishing angle and saying, that's a little too convenient for my tastes. Sure. Anyway, Lauren, go ahead.
Is the criticism really, though, does it focus there on the sports journalist, though, or does it focus on Notre Dame at that point? Because if the journalists are asking for information, wouldn't they first go to Notre Dame? If Notre Dame is in on it, aren't they potentially feeding bogus information to the journalists? I mean, there's there's only so much that the journalist can find on their own, but I think you have to put some of the criticism there on Notre Dame as well. However much they were in on it, however much they failed to do their job in their checking, I don't know. I don't know if the criticism there should have all been on the journalists.
Look, I think you're right. I mean, Notre Dame obviously deserves criticism, not just for the way they generally handle it, but for that self-serving press conference that they did after the story broke. But again, I think part of it is, among fans, okay, let's take Notre Dame fans and take them out of the equation, because they are, like any fan base, they're not rational when it comes to their team. We've seen that with Penn State. We've seen that with Florida State. They might be slightly more irrational than some other fan bases because there's a certain degree of self-anointing when you're a Notre Dame fan and you look at yourself in the moral hierarchy of college sports, but that's another story for another day. But the self-serving nature of the way Notre Dame handled that story from the get-go led you to question, okay, why aren't more people going after them in the way that they've tried to approach this? But again, from a media perspective, what are you gaining out of doing that? And I guess that's maybe what I find the most concerning from a media perspective in all of this, is whether it is the Jameis Winston story or whether it is the stories that go on at USC or whether it's the Manti Te'o story. Outside of Deadspin and a few other online outlets, there seem to be very few mainstream sport coverage centers that are willing to just go after the stories that might be there and really start to ask serious questions of the people involved. I mean, it just seems like, we expect that like Sports Illustrated is going to be the ones that do that, but they haven't exactly covered themselves in glory on a lot of these stories to begin with. And with college athletics especially, there's a lot of stuff that probably needs to be covered, but there's very few people who seem to be able and be willing to put that coverage forward, and I don't know what the answer to that is.
And very telling too how quickly it becomes the coverage of it comes not of critical of the institution, but of the individual in itself, whether the institution is the NCAA or the school, and that's historic across sports. It's always the greedy player, not the greedy team or the greedy league. It's the rogue player, the rogue booster, and not the institution. And so you look at Florida State and the Jameis Winston story. And there's the crab leg story, there's the meme story, there's this whole autograph thing. Michael Rosenberg just actually had a great column, I believe on SI.com, basically saying, look, remember he's accused of raping a girl and still could potentially face charges on that. And so the larger story, kind of what you're talking about, Galen, gets into, and the Times has addressed this. What is Florida State's culpability here? What have they done and not done, not just in its investigation, but in the culture of Tallahassee and its relationship with the police department? And so it goes away from just what did Jameis Winston do into the larger story of kind of like the college athletics culture as a whole. And again, I'm sorry, Lauren, but there's no, I don't know any sports media people who are going to raise that question, because what do they, is there an go back to the agenda setting? Is there an audience for stories like that? Do people want to think about those issues? Should they?
Well, okay, Lauren, I want to get your thoughts on what you were going to say first, and then I'll respond to that. So go ahead.
Well, I think we talked about this on one of the first shows, and when you're talking about why aren't mainstream media outlets covering this, when you look at the media landscape today, I think mainstream journalists are walking a very fine line with media departments. As that landscape is shifting, collegiate media departments are starting to hire their own people. They're promoting their own product. They're not as dependent on the mainstream media outlets as they used to be. So if a mainstream media outlet comes banging in, asking these tough questions, I think at this point, a big league college athletics department is at the point where they can essentially cut them off. We've seen a couple stories. We saw one a few weeks ago that, South Florida denied credentials to the Miami paper?
Yep.
Because
it was Florida International.
Florida International.
But they're fools anyway, but go ahead.
They are, but they did, and they denied credentials. And I think, as more athletic departments have the ability to cover themselves and create their own product, what mainstream journalist is going to come banging in going, give me the true story on Jameis Winston? Let me ask the hard questions. Because are they going to cut off their nose to spite their face?
Yeah, but the problem there is... Oh, Brian, you go ahead and answer that, please. I'll get to mine after you.
To kind of turn that on its head, access is so important, and I don't know if any of them would, but if you get a forward-thinking editor or a reporter, they could think, you're not going to let me come to the game? Okay. I'll write it. There's this growing... I've spoken to some editors who've talked about this idea of sports without access. So kind of like more of a Deadspin-y type model or a Grantland, Bill Barnwell type model of how can we cover a game when we don't have access? Now usually it's they can't afford to make a road trip, so what are they going to do? But I think that opens up to the kind of a hopefully more forward way of thinking that we can still write something off the game that's useful to our readers and if they're going to deny us coverage because we're going to answer tough questions, we'll send out the final score when it's out there. They can get that, or they can get the game-by-game coverage wherever they want to. Like I said, it would take a real forward-thinking editor and a real forward-thinking reporter or enterprising staff to do that because it cuts such against the norm. But I could see that happening. I mean, I think that's kind of what happened with FIU. It would be interesting to see if it happened with a real school, a real program, that one that kind of matters.
I think there's a couple of things at play here. I think you're both bringing up some excellent points. So first, let me get to the issue that we were just talking about, which is this idea of sports coverage without access. I got to be honest with you. The sort of access that is being provided by most, let's just stick with college, but even at the pro level, the sort of access that's being provided isn't really worth much of anything. I mean, you go in and you get, for the most part, the same canned quotes that everybody else is getting. They train the athletes and coaches to where their answers are devoid of personality, devoid of emotion, really not terribly interesting. They all end up in these kind of weird sports logic cul-de-sacs that frankly, you could just as easily get that information from reading the quote sheet at the end of the game. There's nothing incisive really being written by the writers because they're not being given very much. All they're doing is reporting on the game itself, and they're told not to step outside of these boundaries when it comes to commenting on the players, on the coaches, on the general things going on with the league. Yes, you're right, Lauren. If you're competing on that level with athletic departments, with professional sports teams who can afford to hire their own staff, shoot their own video, write their own stories, and give the audience that sort of coverage of their teams, then no, you're not going to be able to compete with that because why go to a second-hand source when you can get it from a first-hand source? But if the concept of journalism is embodying the idea that we're going to provide the audience with the truths that they need to understand what's going on, and that okay, if they're not willing to give us their personality so that we can translate those to the audience, then why don't we give the audience something that they're not getting? The old supply and demand tactic, then to me that would seem to make a lot more sense. And it's obviously a completely different model than what most journalists and most editors and most publishers have come up with. But at some point you're gonna hit a stage where it's like, well, our access is entirely dependent on us only writing positive things, so are we really journalists or are we just public relations operatives? And someone's got to figure that out at some point, and I think Deadspin does a pretty good job of it. I think there's other organizations that, ESPN at times does a good job with it as long as it's not goring their primary financial ox. They do a fairly good job with it. But that's an evolution from a mentality perspective that needs to happen if we're going to see sports journalism be something more than simply the regurgitation of press releases.
You're right about the access issue. When I talk to reporters for my research, especially at the college level, access is atrocious. Major college football, they're bringing out, they bring around the roster, you request who you want at the end of the game. Sometimes they bring out who you request and sometimes you don't, but it's also usually in a scrum or a media room, and you don't have that day-to-day access where you're, the core journalism model of building relationships, getting to know guys and gals, talking to them informally. Nobody goes off the record anymore, people tell me, because they're just assume everything's going to wind up on Twitter. And so yeah, that lack of you're right, the access is shrinking and it's so becoming worthless that you look very puzzled, Galen, very terrified of something.
No, No, I was just listening and thinking about what you were saying. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. But so yeah, that shrinking access is such a concern for reporters, and like I said, it's going to take someone to do a maybe not a Deadspin model, but like a Bill Barnwell model where he does the NFL coverage the next day. It's not the Peter King notes and tidbits of interviews I did, but it's the kind of more statistical, analytical analysis that, frankly, is more valuable. I enjoy reading that a lot more than Peter King's ramblings.
Look, I think the other thing that needs to be considered here is this idea of, we've mentioned several times in this conversation, is there an audience for this or for that? And a lot of times organizations are looking at page views, they're looking at traffic numbers. I think if journalism in general and sports journalism in particular is going to survive into the internet age, there has to be a certain classification of stories that is immune from page views, because the idea of, oh, well, do people really care about this investigative piece on Jameis Winston or this investigative piece on Ray Rice or the NFL as a whole? No, probably not the mass popularity. I mean, I'm sure a BuzzFeed list about cats, living in microwaves is probably going to get far higher numbers than a solid investigative piece of journalism. But that's the point. And I think historically, if we go back and we look at the Washington Post during the Watergate era, do you think the early Watergate stories were really being read and followed by a large number of people? No, they were reading what was going on with the Redskins. They were reading, what was going on with the local arts and entertainment section. That's always the populist element of media consumption. When you start allowing that, and unfortunately the early business model of the internet in terms of journalism has been, let's metricize things by page view, because we've allowed that to be the dominant hierarchical structure of revenue. Suddenly, unless you are bringing in page views, your contribution is considered to be suboptimal or unnecessary. And I think if you look at the history of journalism, Lauren, we've always had this dichotomy between important stories that needed to be there and stories that people were reading in high volume, and they rarely come together until the story reaches a critical mass.
No, exactly, and I think you see that, as it's distilled down. You're talking even in journalism now. They want sound bites. You want quotes. People still don't want the full story. When you talk about, is there an audience for this stuff? I do think there is. Is it going to be the entire nation? No. Is it going to be an entire fan base? No. But I think there is a population that will read that investigative piece, that investigative story. Is it going to get you 1 million page views? No. But like you said, that story needs to be out there and it needs to be reported. And so.
Well, yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree. I think we do need to move away from the metric of page views, but if we move away from page views, then how do we sell advertising, and how do we convince people that our product is worth it?
Well, I think you have to have sites that do multiple things, and you have to have, much like ESPN. Like I know the Bill Simmons suspension has had a lot of people questioning what is Simmons' ultimate worth on the broad marketplace. And Business Insider did a piece where they said, well, Grantland really doesn't bring in that many page views, and neither does 538, and that's true. But what Grantland and 538 bring into ESPN is credibility. They bring in good writers, and when you have populist pieces on a regular basis, and I mean ESPN swims in a bank of money like Scrooge McDuck, so I mean they don't really need it. But there's plenty of sites out there. Deadspin's a good example. There's plenty of fluff. There's plenty of clickbait, and that supports the more, dare I say it, important journalistically based stories that they do. And I think that's the model that you have to have exist. And the problem is, I think a lot of the traditional sources for these sorts of stories, whether that's Sports Illustrated or whether it's the Washington Post or the New York Times, they haven't figured out that you have to have the same bouquet of things that you had when you were on the print version. You just have to have them online. And right now, they're just trying to do one and not the other, and I think that's where they're getting into trouble, because they keep trying to shove everything into the same container, and hopefully they're realizing that doesn't work.
Yeah. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Brian,
as people still argue about pay for page, are we still doing payola pages? I still don't think a lot of them are getting it.
Yeah. No, you're right.
It's a struggle.
We still have a bunch of people who grew up in the non-internet, non-social media era trying to set the business practices of the social media era, and I just think that that's a disaster, and it'll continue to be a disaster until we get people in there who actually understand how the system works and how the audience is willing to receive things and how to spread all of this stuff out. So, Brian, any final thoughts? I think we're going to wrap up on that.
Well, my first question is the cats in the microwave. They're stainless steel microwave on granite countertops, right?
Always, but not dark granite, because I hate dark granite. You can't ever tell if it's dirty or not.
No, absolutely. It needs to be
Oh my
like
God.
space
I'd rather have a good formica, you know.
with the island on the island in the kitchen.
Yes.
Lauren hates us right now.
She'll get over it.
I mean, a lot. Some of the editors I've talked about that balance, and they said that between stories we should do and stories that get page views. And one of them told me, like, if there's an important story using kind of traditional journalism, news values, they'll do it. And his line to me, I think I used this in my dissertation, was, "We'll get page views somewhere else." So there is that idea of balance of, you know, there'll always be something that will get the clicks and the page views, and that there's still this important, you know, the what we think of as important journalism that does need to be done.
Well, look, I think, and the last word on this I'll do myself. I always look at it the same way I look at the music industry. You know, there was a famous incident that happened about 14 years ago where the band Wilco got dropped by Reprise, their label, because there were concerns. Reprise had concerns about their album, so they got dropped. They ended up getting signed by a different subsidiary of Warner for a lot of money, and a lot of people within Reprise were very upset because they looked at Wilco and they said, well, this isn't a band that, they don't sell 1 million records and they don't get onto the top 40 charts, but they're what we call a legacy act. They give us intellectual weight. They bring a certain demographic of audience in that you just don't get with Iggy Azalea or with Ariana Grande or artists like that. And those artists have their place. Those artists move a lot of units. They make a lot of money for the company, but you have to have a balance of both. Otherwise, you have an unbalanced portfolio and you look vapid in the sorts of choices that you're making. And I think that it's even more important because a lot of people don't even know what labels have what artists in music, but everybody knows who's under the ESPN masthead. Everybody knows who's under the Vox masthead if they read it with any regularity. And so as a result, if you don't have something serious and weighty to balance it out, I do think the audience will eventually notice that, and you know, you end up losing what credibility you might have, even if it's not with the audience, even if it's just with other media members, especially in the Twitter age, when the media all are in communication with each other, that carries a tremendous amount of weight. And I think that that's something that we're going to watch with a lot of interest moving forward, particularly in sports, because it's such an insular community. Anyway, I guess that's going to wrap it up. Good conversation, folks. This was good. And Lauren, we did keep the HGTV talk to a minimum, so you had your desired effect.
It was still too much. Too much.
Well, we will come up with more HGTV sports ideas for the next show.
I do look forward to this panel at IACS. This will be very interesting, and
we might all lose our jobs.
I'll start shopping for my dress for the Emmy Awards now.
Yes, I love it.
Get on this train early. Yes, you don't want to be left behind.
Ground floor stuff right here. Anyway, thanks.
Right.
Thanks to all you folks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks to my partners here, Brian Moritz, Lauren Reichard-Smith. I'm Galen Clavio. We will be back next week on the SCRA Show number 7, coming at you Tuesday or Wednesday next week. We'll tweet it out and let you know. Catch you on the flip side, folks. So long, everybody.